At my company's 40th anniversary celebration, my son shocked hundreds of investors by announcing the $90 billion sale of the company I built. Then he said, "You're no longer part of this company. My wife told me it's time to leave. I asked, did you sell it without my patents?" She smirked. "We sold what belonged to us." Then the buyer stood up and said, "Actually, you just bought a company without its technology. I'm so glad you're here with Dad's Revenge Stories. Which city or country are you watching this from? Tell me in the comments." Please note this story includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or locations is strictly coincidental, but the underlying message brings clear value. 40 years. I have built things that outlasted doubt, outlasted debt, outlasted the voices that told me a man with grease under his fingernails and a garage full of half-finished ideas had no business dreaming this large. But standing in the Four Seasons ballroom on a Friday evening in March, surrounded by 300 people in tailored suits and silk gowns, I understood for the first time that 40 years can be dismantled in a single sentence. The room was everything money could make it, chandeliers throwing warm gold across the faces of investors I had known for decades, a jazz trio near the terrace servers moving through the crowd with champagne so cold the flutes wept condensation. A celebration, they had called it. 4 decades of Harrison Energy Systems. 4 decades of my life arranged on cocktail napkins and PowerPoint slides. I ordered water. I have always ordered water. Ethan took the stage at 9 o'clock, and the room responded to him the way rooms always did, settling, leaning forward, giving him their attention without being asked. That part I had always been proud of. My son knew how to hold a room. He had learned it year by year, and watching him walk to that microphone in his charcoal suit, I felt the complicated love of a father who sees himself and something entirely different reflected back at the same time. Tonight. Ethan said, his voice carrying clean and certain through the ballroom. We celebrate 40 years of Harrison Energy Systems, 40 years of vision, 40 years of building something that changed the world. Applause rolled across the room like a wave. I brought my water glass to my lips. Wood and great legacies, Ethan continued, must be carried forward by the right hands. He paused, that practiced pause I recognized, the one he used before announcements he had rehearsed many times. Tonight I am proud to announce that Harrison Energy Systems will be acquired by Caldwell Capital in a transaction valued at $90 billion. The room erupted. I placed my water glass on the nearest table with a steadiness that I had to construct deliberately, piece by piece, because what moved through my chest in that moment was not rage. It was the specific cold shock of a man hearing something he had half suspected and fully hoped was wrong. $90 billion. Announced at a party. Without a single conversation with me. At the far end of the room near the presentation screen, I spotted a man I did not recognize, late 50s, silver-haired, the kind of composed and watchful stillness that belongs to people who are paid to notice everything. He had a leather portfolio open on the table in front of him, and a pen in his hand that had stopped moving the moment Ethan began speaking. I filed him away and said nothing. Then Ethan looked directly at the table where I sat, and his voice did not waver, and that steadiness hurt more than anger would have. Effective immediately, my father, Victor Harrison, will be stepping down from all operational roles. We thank him for his decades of service to this company. Decades of service. 40 years of my life compressed into a line of corporate courtesy spoken by my own son. Vanessa appeared at my elbow before the applause had finished. She bent close, her voice pitched low enough that only I could hear it. And what she said landed in my chest, like a blade finding the exact space between ribs. "It's time to go, Victor. You're done here." The room was still clapping. No one was looking at us. I looked at Ethan. My son would not meet my eyes. I looked at Richard Caldwell standing near the terrace with a champagne flute and the expression of a man watching an investment mature exactly on schedule. Then I looked at Vanessa, who was watching me with the careful, patient attention of someone waiting for a signature. I stood up slowly. Every joint in my 68-year-old body registered the movement. And then, because I had spent 4 decades learning that the most important questions are the ones nobody expects you to ask, I said it clearly enough for the nearest tables to hear. "So you sold the company without my patents? Vanessa's smile flickered just once, just fractionally, before she recovered it. "We sold our business, Victor." Her voice was careful and unhurried, stripped of every edge. "Everything that belongs to Harrison Energy Systems." "That's right," Ethan said from the stage, his microphone still live, because he had heard me and could not stop himself from answering. "We sold what's ours." The silver-haired man at the presentation table stopped writing entirely. He closed his portfolio with a sound that was quiet, but in the sudden small silence around our table perfectly audible. Then he stood unhurried, deliberate with the movements of a man who has just recalculated everything and looked not at Ethan, not at Vanessa, but directly at me. "Actually," said David Walker, lead transaction counsel for the acquiring consortium, and his voice carried the particular measured weight of a man who has spent 30 years in boardrooms knowing exactly when a deal has just become something else entirely. "I think we need to pause." Richard Caldwell's champagne flute stopped halfway to his mouth. Ethan gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles going white under the stage lights, and for the first time that evening, he looked like what he was. A 38-year-old man standing at a microphone in front of 300 people, suddenly unsure of the ground beneath his feet. Vanessa's hand found my arm. Her grip was no longer the managed, gentle pressure of a woman guiding her father-in-law. It was tight, urgent, the grip of someone whose plan has just developed a variable they did not account for. I looked at David Walker across the ballroom. He looked back at me with an expression that I recognized, the expression of a man who has just understood that the most important person in the room is not the one standing at the microphone. "Mr. Harrison," David Walker said, and his voice was very calm, very precise, the voice of a man who bills $400 an hour and earns every cent of it. "I wonder if we might find somewhere quiet to talk." The elevator ride to the 12th floor took 43 seconds. I counted. It is what I do when I need to keep my mind from running ahead of the facts. I find something measurable, and I hold on to it. 43 seconds. Vanessa stood beside me without speaking, her perfume sharp and expensive in the closed space, her eyes fixed on the floor numbers, ticking upward, as though they were the most interesting thing she had ever seen. The room on the 12th floor was not a hotel room. It was a private meeting suite, the kind that costs more per hour than most Americans earn in a week. A mahogany table dominated the center. 4 chairs, a tray of water and coffee that no one had touched. And 3 men who were already waiting when the door opened, Ethan standing near the window with his jacket still buttoned. Richard Caldwell seated at the far end of the table with the stillness of a man who has done this many times before. And a lawyer I did not recognize, young, with a yellow legal pad and a pen already uncapped. None of them looked surprised to see me. That told me everything about how long this room had been planned. "Victor." Richard stood and extended his hand. His grip was firm and dry and lasted exactly 2 seconds, the handshake of a man who has calibrated even that. "Thank you for coming up." "I was escorted," I said pleasantly. Richard's expression did not change. He gestured toward the chair directly across from him. Please, I sat. Vanessa took the chair to my left. Ethan remained at the window, and I noticed he had not looked at me since I walked in. His jaw was set. His right hand was pressed flat against the glass, and I could see from the slight whitening of his knuckles that he was pressing harder than he needed to. Richard nodded at Vanessa, who reached into her clutch and placed the white envelope on the table in front of me. Go ahead and open it, Richard said. Not a request. I picked up the envelope, broke the seal, and removed the document inside. 40 pages, single-spaced, already tabbed with colored stickers at the signature lines. I have reviewed a great many contracts in my life, and I can tell within the first 30 seconds whether a document was drafted by someone who expected pushback or someone who expected none. This one was drafted by someone who expected none. The core terms were simple. The way a trap is simple, $5 million wired within 72 hours of signing. In exchange, I would resign all roles, formal and informal, within Harrison Energy Systems and its subsidiaries. I would sign a perpetual non-compete agreement barring me from any involvement in the energy technology sector for the remainder of my natural life. Under U.S. contract law, lifetime non-competes of this nature are legally questionable in most states, but Texas courts have historically enforced them when tied to a significant financial consideration, and Richard Caldwell's lawyers clearly knew that. I would also agree to a non-disparagement clause, preventing me from making any public statements about the company, the acquisition, or the circumstances of my departure. $5 million. For a company I valued at $90 billion. I read every page. No one spoke. The young lawyer's pen hovered over his legal pad, but did not write anything. Somewhere in the room, the air conditioning hummed at a frequency just below comfortable. When I reached the signature page, I looked up. Ethan was still at the window. He had turned slightly enough that I could see his profile, the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. He looked like a man waiting for a verdict in a courtroom where he already knew the outcome. $5 million, I said, addressing Richard directly. For 40 years. Well, for a clean and amicable transition, Richard said. His voice was smooth as Riverstone. Victor, you've built something extraordinary. No one is disputing that. But Harrison Energy needs leadership that can take it into the next phase. Ethan is ready. The board agrees. Which members of the board? I asked. All of them. Or just the ones you've spoken to privately? Richard's jaw tightened barely, but I caught it. He was not a man accustomed to having his arithmetic questioned out loud. Vanessa leaned forward then, and when she spoke, her voice had shifted from the ballroom's careful warmth into something that felt closer to her actual temperature. Victor, this is generous. Do you understand what the alternative looks like? Contested transitions destroy companies. They destroy families. She paused, letting that land. Ethan needs this to go smoothly. Don't you want that for your son? My son. I looked at Ethan. For the first time since I had walked into the room, he looked back at me. And what I saw in his face cracked something open in my chest. Not anger at him, not yet, but a grief so specific and so sudden that I had to breathe through it carefully, the way you breathe through physical pain. He was ashamed, deeply, visibly ashamed. His eyes were red at the rims, and his throat worked like he was swallowing something that would not go down. He was 38 years old, and he could not look his father in the eye. Ethan, I said quietly. His chin dropped. He turned back to the window. I set the document flat on the table. I smoothed the pages with my palm slowly, the way Eleanor used to smooth a tablecloth before guests arrived, taking care with ordinary things, because care is a habit you either have or you don't. Then I placed my hands in my lap and looked at Richard Caldwell. "I want you to understand something," I said. My voice came out steady, and I was grateful for that. "I am not signing this tonight. I am not signing it tomorrow. I am not signing it in 72 hours or 72 years. I paused. Not because I'm angry. Not because I'm trying to be difficult. I picked up the cufflink pen, gold monogrammed, the one I had given Ethan the day he became CEO, which was sitting on top of the document, where someone had placed it as a gesture I found almost poetic in its presumption. I held it for a moment, then set it back down. Because there is something in this building that does not belong to this transaction. And until someone in this room understands what that is, we have nothing further to discuss. Richard Caldwell looked at me across 40 pages of careful legal language and 5 million reasons to be quiet. His expression did not crack, but his right hand, I noticed, moved from the table to his lap. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and walked to the door. Behind me, I heard Vanessa say something sharp and low to Richard. Not words I could make out, but the tone of someone whose plan has just developed an unexpected variable. I stepped into the hallway, and as the door clicked shut at my back, I heard Ethan's voice through the wood. Not the words, just the sound of it. Rough, breaking at the edges. That sound followed me all the way down the elevator and out into the Houston night, where the air smelled like jasmine and car exhaust, and the particular kind of freedom that only exists when you have just made a decision that cannot be unmade. I drove to the Harrison Energy Building alone the next morning. No radio, no phone calls. Just the Houston streets at 7 a.m., wide and half empty, the sky turning from gray to pale gold above the downtown skyline, and the particular quiet of a man who has not slept and has stopped pretending he might. I parked in my usual spot. Force of habit. My name was still stenciled on the concrete pillar V. Chatatito Harrison founder. Nobody had gotten around to painting over it yet. I stood there for a moment, looking at those two words, feeling something hot and sharp climb up the back of my throat, and then I swallowed it back down and walked to the entrance. The security panel rejected my badge on the first swipe, then the second. The young guard at the desk, a kid named Rourke, who had started 3 months ago and always waved me through with a grin, looked up with an expression of genuine distress, like he had been hoping I would not come in this morning. "Mr. Harrison, sir, I got a notification last night that your access credentials were deactivated," I said. "I know, son. It's all right. Go ahead and call upstairs." He reached for the phone with a hand that was actually trembling. Poor kid, and I stepped back from the desk and looked up at the building. 32 floors of glass and steel that I had chosen, argued over, and paid for. The architect had wanted something flashier. I had wanted something that looked like it was built to last. On the 3rd floor, the Technical Operations Center where the core system control panels lived, the indicator lights were blinking red. A slow, rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat in distress. I had not seen those lights in 40 years of walking into this building. I had designed them myself in 2013, sitting at the kitchen table of the house Eleanor and I shared, before she passed with a cup of coffee gone cold at my elbow, and Claire Morgan on the phone asking me a question that changed everything. "Victor," Claire had said, "does the company own your core technology, or do you?" I had not been able to answer her that night. It had taken me 3 months of legal review patent filings and some of the most uncomfortable conversations of my professional life to arrive at the answer. But the answer, when it came, was clean and irreversible. The core technology, the adaptive energy management algorithm, the proprietary charging protocols, the biometric security architecture belonged to me. Victor Harrison, private citizen, not Harrison Energy Systems. The company held a conditional licensing agreement granting it the right to use the technology under specific terms. One of those terms was explicit if operational control of the company transferred to a new entity without my written consent. The licensing agreement became void, and the system would automatically revert to a locked state requiring my biometric authentication to reactivate. In plain English, without my thumbprint and retinal scan, the technology that made Harrison Energy worth $90 billion would not run. Not the machines, not the production line, not the demonstration units, nothing. I had built that failsafe into the system the same way I built everything quietly, carefully, and without announcing it, to anyone who did not need to know. The company's IT department knew there was a biometric lock on the core system. They did not know the lock was tied to a change of control clause in a private patent agreement. That distinction, as of last night, had become the most important distinction in the American energy sector. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown number, Texas area code. I looked at it for 3 full seconds before I opened the message. It already happened. 3 words. No signature. But I knew the number. I had given that number to exactly one person outside my legal team, a young man I had first met when he was 19 years old, sitting in the Harrison Energy lobby with a worn backpack and a scholarship rejection letter he was too proud to mention, but too devastated to fully hide. Marcus Webb. I had paid his tuition at Rice University out of my own pocket, through a third-party account, and told him only that an anonymous donor believed in engineers who showed up. He had figured out the truth 2 years later and come to my office with the kind of raw-faced gratitude that makes a person feel like they have done something genuinely useful in the world. I had told him to forget it and focus on his work. He had done both, and when Ethan promoted him to executive assistant 4 years ago, he had called me from a payphone of all things to ask if I wanted him to take the position. I had told him yes. I had told him to keep his phone off during important conversations, and I had told him that if anything ever happened that he thought I needed to know immediately, he should send me exactly 3 words. It already happened. I stared at those 3 words until the letters blurred slightly at the edges, and then I looked back up at the 3rd floor. The red lights were still pulsing, slow and steady like something breathing. Mr. Harrison Rourke was back, phone in hand, looking like he genuinely wanted the floor to open and swallow him whole. I reached the executive floor. They said I should let you know that your building access has been formally suspended, pending the completion of the transition, and that if you have any questions, you should direct them to the legal department. The legal department of the company I founded. Thank you, Rourke, I said, and I meant it. The kid was just doing his job, and he looked absolutely miserable about it, which told me something useful about the kind of person he was. Do me a favor. Don't let this morning ruin your week. Sir, His voice cracked slightly. He was maybe 22. I'm really sorry. Don't be, I told him. You didn't do anything wrong. I walked back to my car. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine and looked at Marcus's message one more time. Then I typed back, coffee. 2 blocks east. 20 minutes. Come alone? I put the phone in my pocket, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking space, with my name still stenciled on the pillar behind me. As I turned onto the street, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror of the 3rd floor windows, still blinking red against the pale morning sky. 40 years ago, I had built the lock. I had never once imagined I would be standing outside when it finally engaged. But I had always known with the particular unsentimental certainty of an engineer that if I built it right, it would hold. It was holding. The coffee shop was called Founders. I had never noticed that before, or maybe I had never had reason to. I took the corner table, the one with its back against the wall, and a clear line of sight to both the front door and the window facing the Harrison Energy building across the street. Old habit from 30 years of negotiating in rooms where I needed to see who was coming before they saw me. I ordered black coffee, wrapped both hands around the mug, and watched the building. The red lights on the third floor were visible even from here if you knew where to look. I knew where to look. Marcus Webb walked in at 8:17. He was 35, but moved with the careful deliberateness of someone much older, the walk of a person who had learned young to take up exactly as much space as necessary and not 1 inch more. He wore a gray suit, no tie, his phone conspicuously absent from his hand. He had turned it off before leaving the building. I had taught him that years ago, and the fact that he remembered made something loosen slightly in my chest. He sat down across from me, flagged the server for water, and placed both hands flat on the table where I could see them. That was not something I had taught him. That was something he had figured out on his own, the gesture of a man saying without words that he was not hiding anything. "How long do we have?" I asked. "I told them I had a dental appointment," Marcus said. "An hour, maybe 90 minutes before anyone notices." "Then talk." He talked. For 40 uninterrupted minutes, Marcus Webb laid out what had been happening inside Harrison Energy Systems, while I had been apparently too busy running the company to see it clearly. His voice stayed low and even, but his hands, those careful flat hands, began to press harder against the table as he went on, the tendons standing out along his knuckles. And I understood that the steadiness in his voice was costing him something. Ethan had signed the preliminary acquisition agreement with Caldwell Capital 14 days before the anniversary party. Not a letter of intent, a binding preliminary agreement structured under Delaware corporate law, which meant the board was required to be notified, but not required to hold a formal approval vote until the final closing documents were executed. Richard Caldwell's legal team had threaded that needle with surgical precision, technically compliant, functionally a fait accompli. Who on the board knew?" I asked. "Whitfield," Marcus said, and his jaw tightened visibly. He was the board liaison for the transaction. He signed the notification acknowledgement on behalf of the full board. James Whitfield. I had put him on that board myself in 2019 because I believed he was the kind of man who told you the truth when the truth was inconvenient. My chest ached with a specific bone-deep disappointment that had nothing to do with money. "Keep going," I said. Marcus described the internal chaos of the past 24 hours. 3 separate technical teams called in to examine the locked system. None of them cleared for the level of access needed to understand what they were looking at. Ethan had been in the building since 6 a.m., cycling between his office and the operations floor, with the manic energy of a man trying to outpace a conclusion he could already see coming. Richard Caldwell had sent 2 of his own people, not Caldwell Capital lawyers, but what Marcus described as technical consultants, men with contractor badges who spoke to no one and spent 4 hours in the server room before being escorted out by Harrison Energy's own security chief, who had apparently drawn that line on his own authority and held it. "It's a good man," I said. "He's been with the company 19 years, Marcus said. "He knows whose building it is." I drank my coffee. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, briefly blocking my view of the Harrison Energy entrance. When it cleared, I could see the third-floor windows again, still red, still pulsing. "Ethan," I said. "How is he?" Marcus looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read, not pity, but something adjacent to it. Concern, maybe, for both of us, simultaneously. "He's holding it together in public," he said carefully. "In private, He stopped, pressed his lips together. Then, he put his fist through the drywall in the private bathroom off his office this morning. I heard it from the hallway. That landed in my stomach like a stone. Not because I was glad I was not glad. Because I knew exactly how much force it takes for a man to do something like that. And I knew my son. And I knew that the force required was not anger alone. It was the specific suffocating pressure of a person beginning to understand that the ground beneath them is not what they believed it was. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a thumb drive, small, unmarked, the kind you buy in a 3-pack at any drugstore in America. He set it on the table between us, and the gesture was so quiet and deliberate that it felt almost ceremonial. Every internal communication since January, he said. Every calendar entry, every meeting record, every email chain I had legitimate access to. I haven't read all of it. He met my eyes directly. But I saved all of it. I looked at the drive without picking it up. Marcus, I said. Are you safe? Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe that, after everything I had just heard, that was my first question. Then his expression steadied into something that looked unmistakably like loyalty. Raw and uncomplicated, the kind you cannot manufacture. They have no idea what I know, he said. They never thought to ask. People like Richard Caldwell. He shook his head, and his voice carried a quiet contempt he had clearly been holding for some time. They don't think people like me pay attention. That, I said, picking up the drive and closing my fingers around it, is the most expensive mistake Richard Caldwell has ever made. Marcus exhaled a long, controlled breath that told me he had been carrying the weight of the past 2 weeks in his ribcage and had not had anyone to set it down with until this moment. His eyes went bright, and he blinked hard twice, pressing the emotion back with visible effort. What do you need me to do? He asked. I slipped the drive into my breast pocket next to my heart, which was beating with a steadiness I was genuinely grateful for. Go back, I said. Be exactly who they think you are. And call me tonight, not from your cell. Use the landline at your apartment. He nodded, pushed back his chair, and stood. He was halfway to the door when I said his name. He turned. You did the right thing, I told him. I know it wasn't easy. Marcus Webb, who had grown up without the kind of safety net that makes hard choices feel survivable, pressed his mouth into a line and nodded once, sharp and certain, the nod of a man who has decided who he is and intends to stay that person regardless of the cost. Then he walked out into the Houston morning without looking back. I sat with my coffee and watched the red lights pulse across the street, and I thought about what it means to build something that holds not a company, not a patent, but a person's belief in their own integrity. That, I thought, is the hardest engineering of all. I knew Daniel Ford's address the way I knew my own Social Security number. Not because I looked it up, but because it had simply lived in my memory for so long it had become part of the furniture. The drive to Memorial took 20 minutes through Sunday afternoon traffic, past the kind of Houston neighborhoods where the oak trees are old enough to have opinions. I had made this drive hundreds of times over 40 years for cookouts, for Christmas dinners, for the kind of long Saturday evenings where two men who built something together sit on a back porch and talk about everything except how much they miss the early days. I pulled up in front of Daniel's house and sat in the car for a moment. The fence he had repainted last spring was still that particular shade of colonial blue that his wife Margaret had chosen before she passed. The garden looked tended. The lights inside were on. I rang the bell. Daniel opened the door, and in the half-second before his expression rearranged itself, I saw it, a flash of something raw and stricken moving across his face like a cloud shadow crossing open ground. Not surprise. Dread. Victor, he said. His voice came out rough like a man who had been clearing his throat all morning without success. Hello, Daniel, I said. Can I come in? He stepped back. His hand on the door frame was gripping the wood so hard his knuckles had gone the color of old bone. We sat in the living room, the same room where we had spent 1,000 evenings arguing about battery chemistry and fuel cell tolerances, and whether the Houston Texans would ever figure out their offensive line. Daniel sat in the armchair he always sat in. I sat on the couch across from him. Between us was the coffee table where his grandchildren's drawings were usually scattered. Today it was bare. I placed the printed access log on the table. Single sheet, clean and precise. Daniel Ford's credentials, accessing the core system architecture, at 2:14 a.m., 2:47 a.m., and 3:21 a.m. on 3 separate nights in February. Each entry time-stamped, IP verified, and logged by a security protocol that Daniel himself had helped me design in 2009. Marcus had pulled it from the external monitoring layer, the one I had built separately tied to my personal servers, rather than the company's internal infrastructure. Whatever access they had revoked, they had not thought to look there. He looked at it. His jaw worked like he was chewing something that had turned to dust in his mouth. Then he pressed both hands flat against his thighs and looked up at me, and his eyes were so full of something anguished and ashamed that my own chest seized up so painfully I had to remind myself to breathe. "How much did they pay you?" I asked. Daniel flinched like I had struck him. "Victor, I'm not asking to punish you," I said, and I meant it. "I'm asking because I need to understand how far this went." He exhaled a sound, like something collapsing inward. 250,000, he said. Consulting fee. That's what they called it. $250,000 for 40 years of friendship. For the look on his face right now. "They told me it was straightforward," Daniel said, and his voice was cracking apart at the seams. Now the words coming out jagged and raw. "Get into the secondary architecture document. The access protocols helped them understand what they were buying. They said you had already agreed to step back. They said it was done." He pressed his fist against his mouth for a moment, eyes going bright and wet. "God help me, Victor. I wanted to believe that. I wanted it to be that simple. But it wasn't," I said. "No." He shook his head, the motion heavy and exhausted. 3 attempts. 3 nights I sat at my desk at 2 in the morning, trying to find a way through, and every time the system pushed me back to a layer I had never seen before. A layer neither of us ever built together. He looked at me then with something that was equal parts grief and disbelief. "You put something underneath everything, didn't you? Something you never showed me." "Yes," I said. The sound Daniel Ford made then was not quite a sob, but it was close, a sharp intake of breath that he caught halfway and held his eyes squeezing shut, one hand coming up to cover his face. His shoulders shook once. Just once. Then he pulled himself back together with the visible, painful effort of a 67-year-old man who had spent his whole life believing he was a person of integrity and was now sitting across from the evidence that he had been wrong at least once about the thing that mattered most. "Did you ever think," I said quietly, "about calling me first?" He dropped his hand from his face. His eyes were red-rimmed and wet. "Every night," he said. "Every single night." I stood up. My legs felt older than usual, which happens sometimes when something hurt, in a way that bypassed the mind and went straight to the body. I picked up the access log from the table and folded it once. "They're going to come back to you," I said. "They'll need something else, a statement, a document, something to shore up what they think they're building." I held his gaze. When they ask, don't say no right away. Daniel's brow creased with confusion so genuine it almost broke something in me. What does that mean? I walked to the door. The colonial blue fence was bright in the afternoon sun outside the window, and I thought about Margaret Ford, choosing that color on a Saturday morning with paint swatches spread across the kitchen counter, laughing at something Daniel said. Some things you cannot get back, but some things, if you are careful, and if you are honest, and if you move correctly, you can still protect. It means, I said, that not every door that opens is a trap. Sometimes it's an invitation. I put my hand on the door handle. Take care of yourself, Daniel. I left before he could ask another question, because the answer would have required telling him things it was not yet time for him to know. Claire Morgan's office on the 31st floor of Chase Tower had the best view of downtown Houston that money could buy, and Claire had never once mentioned it in 12 years of working together. That was the thing about Claire. She was the least decorative person I had ever met in the best possible sense. No artwork on her walls except a framed copy of the 14th Amendment and a whiteboard covered in case citations. No plants. No photographs except one small picture on the corner of her desk that I had never asked about and she had never explained. Just files and law and the particular focused intelligence of a woman who had spent 30 years being underestimated by men who later regretted it deeply. I placed the USB drive on her desk at 7:45 in the morning. She was already there. She was always already there. Talk me through it, she said, and plugged it in before I had even sat down. For the next 2 hours, Claire read. I drank her coffee better than mine always and watched her face. Claire Morgan's face while she worked was one of the most instructive things I had ever observed in a professional setting. Most people's expressions drift and wander when they read. Claire's locked in. Her jaw set, her eyes moved with precise rhythmic efficiency, and when she found something significant, her right index finger tapped the desk once, a single quiet percussion that I had learned over 12 years to listen for. She tapped 3 times in the first hour. Each tap landed in my chest, like a stone dropping into deep water. When she finished, she pulled the drive out, set it on the desk between us, and looked at me with an expression I recognized, the look of a lawyer who has just confirmed that her client's situation is simultaneously worse and better than expected. 3 separate violations, she said, leaning back in her chair. First, the preliminary acquisition agreement transfers effective control of Harrison Energy to Caldwell Capital, pending final closing. That triggers your change of control clause automatically. The licensing agreement is already void. The system lock is legally justified, not just technically operational. She held up 2 fingers. Second, Caldwell Capital's offering documents to their investor consortium represent that the technology transfer is complete and unencumbered. That representation is false. Under Section 10B of the Securities Exchange Act, that's securities fraud, federal jurisdiction. She raised a 3rd finger, and her voice sharpened the way it did when she was most certain of something. Third, Daniel Ford's access attempts constitute unauthorized computer access under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. That's a federal criminal statute, Victor. Not civil. Criminal. The room felt very quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, Houston was going about its Monday morning helicopters traffic. The ordinary noise of a city that did not know it was sitting on top of something about to detonate. They built a $90 billion transaction on a foundation they don't own, Claire said. That's what I believed, I said. I needed you to confirm it. Consider it confirmed. She picked up a legal pad and uncapped her pen, a gesture I associated with Claire, shifting from analysis into action. Now, what do you want to do? I want to let them finish building it, I said. And then I want to be there when it falls. Claire's pen stopped moving. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses with an expression that was equal parts professional assessment and something that might in a different context have been called admiration. You're not going to file for an injunction to stop the closing. Not yet. You're going to let them get far enough that there's no walking it back. Far enough that every investor, every regulator, and every board member in that room understands exactly what Richard Caldwell does, I said. Not because I told them, because they saw it. Claire set her pen down and pressed her fingertips together, the gesture she made when she was stress-testing an argument from every angle simultaneously. Her brow furrowed. Her eyes moved to the middle distance. Then she said, "The risk is that the longer we wait, the more investor money gets committed to a transaction that can't close. Real people lose real money, Victor." "I know," I said. The weight of that was not lost on me. It sat in my stomach like something I had swallowed and could not digest. "Which is why I want you to send formal notice to the board today. Not to stop anything, just to create a legal record that they were informed of the ownership dispute before any further commitments were made. If they proceed anyway, that's on them and on Caldwell, not on us." Claire nodded slowly, the nod of a person who had found the answer she was looking for. She uncapped her pen again. "I'll draft the notice this afternoon. It goes to the full board, not just Whitfield." She paused. "And Victor, the Caldwell background material I ran last week. The 2 prior acquisitions." She opened her desk drawer and produced a folder which she slid across the desk. I opened it. The first page was a timeline. The second was a financial summary. By the third page, my jaw had tightened so thoroughly that I could feel it in my back teeth. "He has done this before," I said. "Twice," Claire said, and her voice carried the flat, precise anger of a woman who was very good at keeping her emotions useful rather than decorative. "Same structure both times. Insider access inflated technology claims to investors founder pushed out before closing. First company Austin 2011. Founder received a settlement and a non-disparagement agreement and has not spoken publicly since. Second Denver 2017. Founder fought back but ran out of money before the litigation concluded. Caldwell settled for cents on the dollar." I closed the folder. My hands were absolutely steady, and I was grateful for that because what I felt underneath the steadiness was a cold fury so thorough and so complete that it had passed through heat entirely and come out the other side as something almost peaceful. "He thought I would run out of money too," I said. "Or courage," Claire said. "He doesn't know you very well." "No," I said. "He doesn't." I stood, picked up the folder, and looked at Claire Morgan, this woman who had asked me 12 years ago the question that had changed everything. "How long before they start pushing for an accelerated closing?" 2 weeks, she said. "Maybe 3. The system lockout is creating pressure they can't explain to their investors. They'll need to move fast or the deal dies on its own." "Then we have 2 weeks, I said. Claire was already writing when I reached the door. I paused my hand on the frame. "One more thing," she said without looking up. "The Caldwell file, there's a third case, incomplete. Started in Phoenix in 2022. The founder disappeared from public record 18 months ago." She looked up then, and her eyes were steady and serious. "I don't know what that means yet. But I thought you should know it exists, because if Richard believes he can make founders disappear quietly, he has already decided what happens to Ethan when this is over." I held that information for a moment, feeling it settle into the architecture of everything else I now understood about Richard Caldwell. Then I nodded, once walked out of Chase Tower, and stepped into the Houston morning, carrying the particular weight of a man who has just confirmed that the fight he is in is larger and more serious than even he had imagined. The days after my meeting with Claire moved slowly, the way dangerous things often do not with the rushing urgency of a storm, but with the patient grinding pressure of a fault line shifting deep underground, invisible to everyone standing on the surface. I stayed away from the Harrison Energy Building entirely. There was nothing useful I could accomplish by standing outside it, and a great deal I could accomplish by staying in my apartment and answering the phone every evening when Marcus called from the landline in his kitchen. He called at 9 o'clock, without exception, every night that first week. I started keeping a legal pad on the table beside my reading chair, the same chair Eleanor had reupholstered in green leather the year before she passed, the one she used to say was the ugliest and most comfortable thing she had ever touched. I wrote down everything Marcus told me in the same handwriting I had used to fill notebooks in the garage 40 years ago, small, precise, slanted slightly to the right. 3 more technical teams today, Marcus said on Tuesday evening, and I could hear the controlled tension in his voice, the sound of a man performing normalcy in a situation that was anything but. 2 from outside contractors, 1 internal. None of them got past the secondary authentication layer. How is Ethan responding to that? He called a meeting at 7 this morning. Marcus exhaled sharply. Victor, he stood in front of 15 engineers and told them the system lockout was a cybersecurity protocol triggered by the transition announcement and that it would be resolved within 48 hours. A pause. He said it like he believed it. That hit me somewhere tender. My son standing in front of people who had dedicated years to building something real and telling them a story he had been given instead of the truth he did not yet have. And the engineers? I asked. They nodded, Marcus said, and his voice carried the particular sadness of someone who respects people enough to be hurt on their behalf. They trust him, Victor. They still trust him. That's the hardest part to watch. On Thursday, something shifted. Marcus called 20 minutes early, which had never happened before, and his voice when I answered had a different quality, tighter, like a wire strung too close to its breaking point. There was a closed meeting this afternoon, he said. Richard Caldwell, Ethan, and 2 people from Caldwell Capital's legal team. I was not in the room, but I was in the hallway when Richard came out. What did you hear? Not much, but enough. Marcus took a breath that was audible even through the phone line. Richard said, and I am giving you his exact words, "We need to close before anyone starts asking questions we can't answer." And then he said, "Ethan, this is about protecting both of us. If this falls apart, it falls apart on everyone." I pressed the pen hard enough against the legal pad that the tip went through the paper. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice level with the specific effort of a man who has learned that panic is a luxury he cannot afford. Did Ethan respond? He said, "I understand." But Victor. Marcus stopped. When he continued, his voice was raw and quiet, like something had scraped it on the way out. The way he said it, he didn't sound like a man who understood. He sounded like a man who was starting to realize he didn't understand anything at all. I set the pen down. That sentence expanded in the room around me, filling up the corners, and I sat with it for a long moment before I trusted myself to speak. "Are you logging everything?" I asked. "Every word I can reach," Marcus said. "Victor, there's one more thing." His voice dropped further, careful now, in the way of someone choosing each word before releasing it. I ran a quiet search on the 2 Caldwell Capital people in that meeting. One of them is a crisis communications attorney, not a transaction lawyer, a crisis lawyer. That distinction was not small. Transaction lawyers close deals. Crisis lawyers manage the aftermath when deals go catastrophically wrong. They build narratives. They manage liability exposure. They identify who carries the weight when the structure collapses. Bringing a crisis lawyer into a transaction before it closes meant someone at Caldwell Capital was already planning for a specific kind of failure. Richard is building himself a landing pad, I said. And Ethan is the ground, Marcus said, and his voice broke slightly on the last word, just fractionally, just enough, because Marcus Webb was 35 years old, and he had worked beside Ethan Harrison for 4 years, and whatever Ethan's failures were, Marcus was not a person who found satisfaction in watching someone fall. Go home, I told him. Get some sleep. You're doing everything right. Victor? His voice had steadied again, but underneath the steadiness, I could hear the strain of someone carrying more than his share of a very heavy thing. Is there anything else I can do? I looked at the legal pad in my lap. 3 pages of notes in my small, slanted handwriting. A map of everything happening inside that building, while I sat in Eleanor's green leather chair and waited. One thing, I said. If Ethan asks you to delete anything, emails, calendar entries, anything at all, make 3 copies first, then delete it exactly as he asked. I understand, Marcus said. Good night, Marcus. I put the phone down, looked out the window at the Houston skyline going dark, and thought about Richard Caldwell's crisis lawyer sitting in a room with my son, and about what it means to watch someone build a fire and say nothing, because sometimes the only way to show a person how badly they are going to be burned is to let them feel the heat themselves. Marcus sent the link at 6:43 in the morning, before I had finished my first cup of coffee. I saw the notification on my phone, a local Nevada news outlet, Henderson Bureau, and something in my stomach dropped before I had even tapped the screen. Not because I was surprised, because I had known with the quiet certainty of an engineer who understands exactly what happens when you run an incomplete system at full load, that this moment was coming. I had simply hoped I was wrong about the timing. I was not wrong about the timing. The headline read, Explosion at Harrison Energy Testing Facility, Henderson, NV. No casualties, reported damage under assessment. The article was brief and factual in the way of early morning breaking news, a controlled testing environment, a prototype unit, a thermal event that investigators were describing as an equipment malfunction. Nevada OSHA, the state's Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which has jurisdiction over industrial facility incidents, had dispatched inspectors within the hour. I set my coffee down and called Claire. She picked up on the second ring. I already saw it, she said, and her voice had the quality of a person who had been awake for some time. I'm drafting the notification letter now. Walk me through what happened, I said. Technically, I want to hear you say it. The outside engineering team Ethan hired, and I want to be precise here, Victor, because this matters legally. They were working from Harrison Energy's internal documentation, not from your original patent specifications. Those are 2 different things. Claire's voice was crisp and certain, the voice she used when she needed me to follow every word exactly. Your adaptive energy management algorithm contains a thermal load distribution protocol that is not documented in any internal company file. It exists only in your original patent filing and your personal technical records. Without that protocol, any prototype operating above 60% capacity will experience uncontrolled thermal buildup within approximately 4 minutes of activation. And they ran it at full load, I said. The news report mentions a demonstration environment, Claire said, which means they were trying to show the system working at full capacity to impress someone, probably Caldwell's people. I pressed my free hand flat against the kitchen counter and breathed through my nose for a moment. Not from grief, or not only from grief, from the specific, suffocating weight of being right about something you desperately wished you had been wrong about. Was anyone hurt? I asked, because that was the question that mattered first, before everything else. The article says no casualties, Claire said. 3 people were treated for minor smoke inhalation and released. The prototype unit is a total loss. The testing bay sustained significant structural damage. Asu. 3 people, I said. 3 people who went to work that morning, believing they were building something real, not knowing they were running an experiment on a system nobody in that room fully understood. Victor. Claire's voice gentled slightly. Not soft. Claire was never soft, but calibrated. This is not your fault. You did not send those people into that room. You did not ask anyone to replicate your technology without authorization. I know, I said. That doesn't make it easier to hear. No, she agreed. It doesn't. But here is what it does do. Her voice sharpened again, back into attorney mode, focused and forward-moving. Under Nevada state law and federal patent statute, unauthorized replication of patented technology that results in property damage and personal injury, even minor injury, creates significant civil liability for the party that commissioned the replication. That is, Ethan Harrison acting as CEO of Harrison Energy Systems, hiring an outside contractor to reproduce technology he did not control. A pause. And the contractor will know that by now. Their lawyers will have been called before the smoke cleared. I thought about that. A contractor facing liability for a job that turned out to involve intellectual property they were never told about. A job commissioned by a CEO who told them the technology was company property. A job that had just put 3 people in a medical facility and destroyed a testing bay. They'll cooperate, I said. Their only alternative is to carry the liability alone, Claire said. Yes, they'll cooperate. She paused again. How is Ethan? I don't know yet, I said. Marcus will call tonight. Victor. There was something in her voice that made me pay attention in a different way. Not the attorney's precision, but something more personal. Whatever Ethan did, whatever he agreed to with Richard Caldwell, he is going to be sitting in his office right now, looking at a news report about a building that exploded, and understanding for the first time that this is not a business negotiation anymore. This has consequences that cannot be walked back. She was right. And the image of my son sitting alone in that office looking at his phone screen with the particular expression of a man watching the ground approach, that image did something to my chest that 40 years of business had not prepared me for. Send the regulatory notification today, I told her. Make certain Nevada OSHA and the Federal Patent Office both receive formal notice that Harrison Energy Systems does not hold authorization to replicate or operate the core technology in any testing environment. Already writing it, Claire said. Victor, one more thing. When Marcus calls tonight, ask him who was in the room when Ethan got the news. I understood why she was asking. The people around Ethan in that moment, how they responded, what they said. Whether Richard Caldwell's crisis attorney was already on the phone managing the narrative that would tell us everything about what was coming next. I hung up, stood in my kitchen in the early Houston morning, and thought about a prototype unit in Henderson, Nevada, burning down to its frame because someone had tried to run it without the one piece of code that made it safe. All that effort, all that desperation, and all of it in the end undone by the single layer of protection that only I had ever known was there. I had built it to hold. It was still holding, just not in the way anyone had expected. Before I tell you what Richard Caldwell said behind closed doors, the words that revealed exactly what he had planned for my son. From the very beginning, I need to know you're still with me. Drop a 1 or just type "still here" in the comments right now, because what's coming next is the moment everything changed, and I don't want you to miss a single word of it. And a quick note before we go further: parts of this story contain fictional elements woven in to bring the deeper truth to life. If that's not your kind of content, no judgment at all, you're free to step away now. But if you're staying, buckle up. Marcus called at 6 in the morning that Monday, far earlier than his usual 9 o'clock, and the moment I heard his voice, I knew something had broken overnight in a way that could not be repaired. He was alone, Marcus said without preamble. When the Nevada news came through, Richard Caldwell's attorney called Ethan's cell at 7:15. Friday morning spoke for 4 minutes and hung up. Ethan sat in his office by himself for 6 hours after that. Didn't take meetings, didn't eat. I left a sandwich outside his door at 2 in the afternoon. It was still there when I came in this morning. Something ached behind my sternum. Not surprised, just the specific exhausted grief of watching something you predicted come true, and wishing with everything you had that you had been wrong. What happened after 6 hours? I asked. Richard Caldwell came in person, Marcus said, and his voice tightened the way it did when he was choosing words with extreme care. He was in Ethan's office for 40 minutes. When he left, he stopped in the hallway and made a phone call. I was close enough to hear his side of it. A pause that stretched just long enough to tell me Marcus was deciding whether to say the next thing. Then, he said, "The Nevada situation is Ethan's exposure, not ours. Make sure that distinction is clear in every document going forward." I pressed the phone hard against my ear and stared at the ceiling of my apartment. "Every document going forward," I repeated. "Yes, sir." That phrase was not accidental. Richard Caldwell had not built 3 acquisition campaigns by being careless with language. Every document going forward meant his legal team was already retroactively restructuring the paper trail, isolating Ethan's decisions, creating a documented separation between Caldwell Capital's instructions and Ethan Harrison's actions. Under Section 10B of the Securities Exchange Act, the person who makes materially false statements to investors about an asset's ownership status bears primary liability for securities fraud. Richard was building a wall brick by brick between himself and the transaction he had orchestrated, and he was using Ethan's signature on every document as the mortar. "Marcus," and I said, "did Ethan come out of his office after Richard left?" I told him. "Yes." Marcus exhaled a long, ragged sound. "He walked the engineering floor for about 20 minutes. Just walked. Didn't talk to anyone. He stopped at the window at the end of the hall, the one that looks out toward the testing bay mock-up, and he stood there with both hands on the glass." His voice dropped. "Victor, his shoulders were shaking. He was crying. Right there in the hallway where anyone could have seen him. I don't think he knew I was watching. Ethan, my 38-year-old son, standing at a window with his hands pressed against the glass and his shoulders shaking alone in a building full of people who still trusted him and had no idea what was happening on the floor above their heads." My eyes burned. I pressed the heel of my hand against them and breathed carefully, the way you do when grief tries to arrive before you are ready to receive it. "You did the right thing," I told Marcus, not interrupting him. "I didn't know what I would have said," Marcus admitted, and his voice was rough with something genuine. "Victor, does he know yet about what Richard is doing to him?" "No," I said. "He doesn't." "Are you going to tell him?" I thought about that question for longer than Marcus probably expected. Outside my window, Houston was waking up, the distant hum of the freeway, the sound of a neighbor's door, the city resuming its ordinary business, while extraordinary things happened inside it. No, I said finally. Not yet. I'm going to let Richard finish. Marcus made a sound that was caught halfway between understanding and distress. How much further does this go before I move, I said. Until there is no version of events in which Richard Caldwell can rewrite what he did. Until every investor, every regulator, and every member of that board has seen enough that no crisis lawyer in Washington can put a different face on it. My voice was coming out steadier than I felt, which was a habit of 68 years that I was grateful for. Can you keep going a little longer? Yes, Marcus said, without hesitation, without drama, just the clean, direct answer of a person who has decided something and does not need to announce it. Yes, I can. Good man, I said. One more thing. Ethan is going to call me again. Probably soon. I thought of the missed call on my phone from the week before, Ethan's name on the screen, the phone ringing out. When he does, I need you to make sure he calls from somewhere private. Not his office. Not his cell if he can help it. I'll make sure he knows to use the conference room on 12, Marcus said. The one with the signal blocker you had installed in 2019. I had installed that room for sensitive negotiations with outside partners and then forgotten about it entirely. Marcus had not forgotten about it. That told me something about the quality of attention he paid to everything around him, the kind of attention that most people in positions of power never notice until they desperately need it. Tonight, I said. Call me tonight, same time as always, and Marcus, eat something today. Both of you. He made a sound that might have been a short, exhausted laugh. Then he hung up, and I sat in Eleanor's green leather chair with the phone in my lap and thought about my son standing at a window with his hands on the glass and his body shaking with everything he could not yet say out loud. And I understood with a clarity that hurt all the way down to the bone that the hardest part of what I was doing was not fighting Richard Caldwell. It was waiting long enough for Ethan to see the truth on his own. The morning of the New York roadshow, Claire arrived at my apartment at 7 a.m. with a thermos of coffee and a legal pad already half filled with notes. Marcus is in position, I asked, holding the door open. Seated 3 rows back, left aisle, she said, walking straight to the dining table and spreading her materials without ceremony. He'll stream audio through his jacket pocket. The feed routes through an encrypted relay, nothing traceable. She looked up. How are you? Steady, I said, which was mostly true. Good. She uncapped her pen. Then let's watch them build the fire. For the next 2 hours, we sat at my dining table in Houston, while 200 international investors assembled in the Javits Center in Manhattan, a room I knew from 3 previous industry conferences with its cathedral ceilings and its wall of glass looking north toward Midtown. I could picture it, precisely the staging, the lighting designed to make everything look sleek and inevitable, the Harrison Energy branding on every surface. Marcus's audio feed connected at 9:14. The ambient sound of the room came through first, the low, textured hum of 200 conversations, and then the lights dropped and the room settled. Ethan's voice came through the feed, and even through the compression of the audio relay, I could hear what I recognized as the absolute outer limit of his composure. He was performing. Every word was calibrated, every pause deliberate. He had always been brilliant at this. My heart contracted with a grief so precise it felt surgical. Harrison Energy Systems represents the most significant advance in grid-scale energy storage of the past 2 decades. Ethan said, and his voice did not crack, and I hated how much that cost him, how much effort was behind that steadiness. Today, we are pleased to demonstrate the system's capabilities in real time. Claire looked up from her legal pad and met my eyes. Her expression was the professional equivalent of a held breath. The audio feed carried the sound of equipment being connected, the particular sequence of clicks and hums I knew better than my own heartbeat, because I had designed the startup sequence myself. A murmur moved through the crowd as the demonstration screen illuminated. Then came the sound I had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure, a single definitive tone. Low, final. The system's audio signal for authentication required. That's the biometric prompt, I told Claire, though she already knew. I know, she said quietly. Through the feed, I heard a technician's voice, strained, barely audible, and then the same tone again and again. Each repetition landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples expanding outward through 200 people who had flown from London and Tokyo and Riyadh to watch a $90 billion technology perform. Marcus whispered into his collar. The screen is showing the authentication error. Everyone can see it. The murmur in the room changed quality from the anticipatory hum of an audience waiting to be impressed to something lower and more unsettled. The sound of 200 people recalibrating their understanding of what they were looking at. Then Ethan spoke, and what he said next was the bravest and most devastating thing I had heard him do in 38 years. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a technology access issue that is currently under resolution. His voice was controlled, but underneath it, if you knew him the way I knew him, there was a fracture running through every syllable. We appreciate your patience as our technical team works to address this. Claire set her pen down on the legal pad and pressed both hands flat against the table. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet. He just told 200 international investors on the record in front of multiple financial journalists that he cannot access the technology he asked them to commit $90 billion to. Yes, I said. That is a material misrepresentation to investors, she said. Under Regulation FD and Section 10B, every word spoken in that room is now part of the public record. The gap between what he represented and what he just demonstrated, that gap is the lawsuit, Victor. That is the SEC investigation. That is the end of the transaction as structured. I could hear through the audio feed the sound of chairs moving, people standing, the low, controlled chaos of a room that has just watched something go wrong in a way that cannot be explained away. Marcus whispered, "People are leaving. The Caldwell Capital team is huddled at the back. Richard is not in the room." Richard was not in the room. Of course he was not. "Call the board," I told Claire. "Send the formal notification today, not tomorrow." She was already writing. "Done by noon," she said. The feed cut out a few minutes later, Marcus moving, adjusting his position in the emptying room. In the quiet that followed, I sat with the particular heaviness of a man who has just watched something he built come apart in a room he was not in for reasons that had nothing to do with the technology and everything to do with the people who had decided they owned it. My phone rang while Claire was still writing. Not Marcus, not Claire's office. A Texas number that I recognized after a moment's pause, and that recognition sent a different kind of current through my chest entirely. Daniel Ford. I looked at Claire. She looked at the phone. Neither of us had expected this call today at this moment from this particular man. "Answer it," Claire said, and her voice carried something that was not quite surprise and not quite certainty, something in between the tone of a lawyer who has learned never to be astonished by the timing of human conscience. I picked up the phone. "Daniel," I said. His voice on the other end was the voice of a man who had been awake for a very long time and had finally decided that sleep was less important than the thing he needed to say. "Rough?" raw, stripped of every professional veneer. "Victor," he said, "I need to meet with you. Tonight. I have something you need to see." I answered Daniel's call on the second ring. "The coffee shop on Richmond," I said before he could speak. 8 o'clock, same table as always. A pause. Then his voice rough as gravel and twice as heavy. "You already knew I was going to call. I knew you were going to have to make a choice eventually," I said. "I'm glad you made it tonight." I arrived early. The coffee shop on Richmond Avenue had been our place for 30 years. Daniel and I had argued about battery tolerances and market timing and the Houston Texans' offensive line at that corner table more times than either of us could count. Tonight the shop was half empty, the overhead lights warm and low, a country song playing soft enough that I could hear the rain beginning outside. I ordered black coffee and sat with my back to the wall the way I always did and waited. Daniel came through the door at 8:03, and the moment I saw him, my chest seized with something that was equal parts grief and recognition. He had aged a decade in the 6 weeks since I had last sat across from him in his living room. His shoulders carried themselves differently, lower, heavier, the posture of a man who had been bearing something alone for too long, and had finally stopped pretending it wasn't crushing him. He was clutching a worn leather briefcase against his side with both arms wrapped around it, like a man carrying something he was afraid to drop. He sat down across from me, placed the briefcase on the table between us, and pressed both hands flat on top of it. His fingers were trembling a fine, constant tremor that he could not quite control, and that told me more about the past several weeks than any words he could have chosen. "I watched the New York feed," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. "On the news. I saw what happened at the Javits Center." "So did a lot of people," I said. "Victor." His jaw worked. His eyes were red-rimmed and glassy, the eyes of a man who had been fighting tears for hours and was losing the battle by degrees. "I need you to understand something before I open this case. What I did, taking their money, trying to access your system, I told myself 100 different stories about why it wasn't what it was." He pressed his lips together hard. Every single one of those stories was a lie, and I knew it. I knew it every night when I couldn't sleep and every morning when I looked in the mirror. A tear broke loose and ran down the side of his face. He did not wipe it away. "I am so sorry. I am sorrier than I know how to say, and I understand if that doesn't mean anything to you anymore." The grief in my chest expanded until it filled every available space. I thought about 40 years of cookouts and arguments and late nights in the garage. 40 years of a friendship that had survived recessions and failures and the particular loneliness of building something that most people thought was impossible. And I thought about a 67-year-old man sitting across from me with tears on his face and a briefcase full of the only thing he had left to offer. "Open the case, Daniel," I said. My voice came out gentle. Not because I had forgiven everything, forgiveness is a longer road than one evening, but because the man across from me was already punishing himself more thoroughly than I ever could. Daniel unlatched the briefcase with hands that shook so badly he had to try twice. Inside was a collection of documents that made my breath stop for just a moment. Printed emails, handwritten notes, a small recording device, a USB drive, and a bound folder with Caldwell Capital's internal letterhead across the cover. "Everything," Daniel said, pressing the back of his hand against his mouth to steady himself. "Every communication they sent me, every instruction, the payment records structured through 3 shell accounts in Delaware, but Claire will find the thread." He touched the recording device. "And this. 6 conversations. Richard Caldwell's voice, his exact words, telling me that Ethan would be. His voice broke completely for a moment. He breathed through it visibly, his chest heaving once before he pulled himself back. Telling me that Ethan would be removed from the company within 60 days of closing. That the boy was, and I am quoting exactly, a useful face and nothing more. The words landed in my chest like something physical. My son. A useful face and nothing more. Said by this man whose daughter Ethan had married, whose family Ethan had trusted with everything. Does Ethan know? I asked. Daniel shook his head hard, fresh tears spilling. No. God, no. Victor, I almost told him a dozen times. I almost called him. He pressed both fists against the table, his knuckles white and shaking. I was a coward. I took the money and I told myself it wasn't my business and I was a coward. You're here now, I said. It's not enough. His voice was raw and broken and absolutely certain. I know it's not enough. But it's what I have. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his fists. Those trembling, white-knuckled hands of a 67-year-old man trying to hold himself together. It's enough to do what needs to be done, I said. Claire will contact you tomorrow. You'll need to provide a formal statement and cooperate fully with the investigation. Whatever they need, Daniel said immediately. Whatever it takes. There will be consequences for you, I told him honestly. Your name will be in the record. People will know you were involved. He nodded, and something in his face shifted, a settling, like a man who has been running from something, finally stopping and turning around to face it. I know, he said. I've known for weeks. Victor. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, scraped clean of everything except the truth. Do you think you can ever... He stopped. Started again. We're not what we were, I said. I won't pretend otherwise. But you came here tonight. That matters. I squeezed his hands once, then released them. That matters, Daniel. He covered his face with both hands, and his shoulders shook, not the fine tremor of before, but something deeper. The shaking of a man letting go of something he has been carrying alone for far too long. I let him. Sometimes the most useful thing one person can do for another is simply stay in the room. When he finally lowered his hands, his face was wrecked and wet and somehow lighter. There's one more thing, he said, wiping his face roughly with his sleeve. Richard is pushing for an emergency board meeting next week. He wants to force the closing before any court can issue an injunction. He met my eyes. And Victor, he told his people he knows you'll show up. He said he has someone inside that boardroom. The documents from Daniel's briefcase covered every inch of Claire Morgan's conference table by 7 the next morning. I had not slept. Claire, I suspected, had not slept either when I arrived at Chase Tower at 6:45. She was already there with her reading glasses on and a highlighter in each hand, moving through the printed emails with the focused intensity of a surgeon working a particularly complex case. 3 empty coffee cups stood in a row at the edge of the table like sentinels. A 4th was in her hand. Tell me what you have, I said, dropping into the chair across from her. Did I have enough to end Richard Caldwell's career in American finance? She said, without looking up. The question is whether we use it to stop the transaction, or whether we use it to ensure that when the transaction collapses on its own, there is no version of events in which he walks away clean. She set the highlighter down and finally looked at me over the top of her glasses. Those are 2 different strategies with 2 different timelines. He's calling an emergency board meeting, I said. Daniel says he's pushing for next week. Claire's expression sharpened. Then we don't have the luxury of timeline anymore. She stood and moved to the whiteboard on the far wall, uncapping a marker with a decisive click. 3 categories of evidence. First, she wrote as she spoke, her handwriting fast and precise. Financial fraud. The shell account payments to Daniel structured through 3 Delaware entities to obscure the source. Under the Bank Secrecy Act and federal money laundering statutes, structuring payments, specifically, to avoid reporting thresholds, is a criminal offense. Claire drew a line. Second, securities fraud. Richard's recorded statements misrepresenting the technology ownership status to the acquiring consortium. Combined with the Javits Center roadshow disaster, we have documented on-record misrepresentation to investors. She drew a second line beneath it. Third, and this is the one that protects Ethan, the recorded conversation, in which Richard explicitly states that Ethan will be removed within 60 days of closing, and describes him as a useful face. That establishes that Ethan was himself a victim of material deception. It does not eliminate his civil liability, but it substantially changes the criminal exposure picture. I watched her write and felt the particular exhausted satisfaction of watching someone you trust do exactly what they are best at. My eyes were burning from the sleepless night, and my chest was tight in the way it had been for weeks, that constant low-grade pressure of a man carrying something heavy over a long distance. "What about Whitfield?" I asked. Claire capped her marker. "That's where I need Marcus." I called Marcus from the conference room speaker on. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting. "James Whitfield," I said. "Richard's man inside the board." "How certain are you?" 100%, Marcus said, and his voice was flat and certain in a way that left no room for doubt. Ethan's document pointed me to the right account number. I found the full connection 3 days ago. Whitfield holds a private investment position in a Caldwell Capital feeder fund, established 14 months ago, 2 months before the acquisition discussions began. It's structured through his wife's maiden name. Under Delaware disclosure law and the board's own conflict of interest policy, he was required to recuse himself from any transaction involving Caldwell Capital. He did not disclose. He did not recuse. A pause. "Victor, he voted to approve the preliminary agreement." The words hit the room like a physical thing. Claire pressed her lips together so hard they went white, and I watched her absorb the information with the controlled fury of a woman who has spent 30 years watching people in positions of trust abuse them. "On that voids his vote," Claire said, her voice clipped and precise. "And depending on how the other votes were structured, it may void the board's preliminary approval entirely. Which means the transaction has no valid board authorization." She turned to me. "Victor, if we bring this to the full board before the emergency meeting, we don't just stop the closing. We invalidate the process that got them here." "Do it," I said. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, and something in his tone made both Claire and me go very still. "I've been watching Ethan for the past 3 days, since the Javits Center." His voice dropped. "He's not sleeping. He's been in the office until midnight every night, just sitting there, going through files. I think he's starting to understand what happened to him." A beat of silence. "Victor, I think if someone put the right information in front of him, the recording, the 60-day plan, he would choose differently than he chose at the beginning." Claire looked at me across the conference table. Her expression asked the question without words. I thought about my son sitting in his office until midnight, going through files with the desperate focus of a man trying to find the place where everything went wrong. I thought about what it costs a person to finally see the truth they have been running from, the specific shattering weight of it. We need Ethan, Claire said quietly. Not just as a witness, as someone who stands up in that room and tells the board what was done to him. Victor, without that, Richard's lawyers will spend 6 months turning this into a family dispute and a disgruntled founder. I pressed my thumb and forefinger against my eyes, feeling the exhaustion of weeks pressing behind them. Then I dropped my hand and looked at Claire with the clarity that comes sometimes after you have run out of ways to avoid the thing you know you have to do. "I'll call him," I said. "Tonight, at the apartment." I paused. Not his office, not his cell, the landline at my apartment. Marcus makes sure he knows to use a payphone or a landline when he calls back. "Already done," Marcus said quietly. "He asked about you yesterday, Victor. He asked if you were—" Another pause, careful and tender. "He asked if you were okay." Something cracked open in my chest. Small, sudden, unexpected, the way the first fracture in ice sounds before the whole surface shifts. My son sitting alone in an office at midnight, going through files, asking through an intermediary if his father was okay. "Tell him," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended, "that I will be, and that I need to talk to him." Ethan knocked on my door at 8:15 that evening. I had not heard that knock in 38 years. Hesitant, almost apologetic, the knock of a boy who was not sure if he was welcome. When I was a young father, and Ethan was small, he used to knock on my study door exactly like that, before asking if I wanted to come outside and throw a ball. I had always said yes. Always. No matter how deep into a calculation I was, I had always said yes. I opened the door. He was not the polished CEO who had stood at a microphone 6 weeks ago. He was not the man in the charcoal suit who had refused to meet his father's eyes in the ballroom of the Four Seasons. He was just Ethan, my son, standing on my porch, in a wrinkled button-down, with shadows so deep under his eyes, they looked like bruises. His hair unwashed his jaw, carrying 3 days of stubble he had not bothered to address. He looked like a man who had stopped performing and had nothing left underneath the performance. "Dad," he said. His voice broke on the single syllable. "Come in," I said. "I made coffee." He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had done homework as a boy, where Eleanor had helped him with geometry proofs, and I had taught him to read a balance sheet. I set 2 mugs down and sat across from him, and I placed Daniel's briefcase on the table between us without explanation. "Read it," I said. "Take as long as you need." Ethan looked at the briefcase, then at me, then back at the briefcase. His hands moved toward the latches and stopped. "What's in it?" he asked, and his voice was the voice of someone who already knew on some level that the answer was going to cost him something he could not get back. "The truth," I said. "About Richard. About what he planned for you." Ethan's throat worked. He unlatched the case with fingers that trembled against the metal. He lifted the first document, the email chain, Richard's instructions to his legal team, and began to read. I drank my coffee. I did not watch him. I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where he had learned to ride a bicycle, where Eleanor had planted roses that still came back every spring without her, and I listened to the sound of my son reading the story of his own betrayal. He read for 1 hour and 19 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the stove the way I used to watch it when Ethan was a teenager and past curfew, counting the minutes between worry and relief. The sound that finally broke the quiet was not words. It was a sharp, ragged intake of breath, the sound of a man whose lungs have seized up on him, followed immediately by Ethan's fist coming down on the table hard enough to rattle both coffee mugs. He pressed that fist against his mouth, his whole body shaking, his eyes squeezed shut, so tight the corners went white. "A useful face," he said, and his voice was barely recognizable, thick and torn and raw as an open wound. That's what he called me, a useful face and nothing more. He opened his eyes, and they were blazing and wet simultaneously, fury and anguish occupying the same space. Vanessa knew. She had to have known. His voice cracked wide open. I loved her, Dad. I thought she... He stopped, pressed his fist harder against his mouth. A tear broke free and ran down his jaw, and he did not try to stop it. My heart was breaking for him. Cleanly, completely, the way it had broken the day he fell off that bicycle in the backyard and looked up at me from the ground with the same expression, the expression of someone who has just discovered that the world can hurt you in ways you did not anticipate. Ethan, I said, I threw away everything you built. His voice collapsed into something almost inaudible. I stood at that microphone and Dad, I thanked you for your service. Like you were an employee. Like 40 years of your life was something I could summarize in a line. He pressed both hands flat on the documents, his shoulders heaving. I am so ashamed. I am so ashamed I cannot breathe. I stood up, walked around the table, and placed both hands on my son's shoulders. He was shaking under my palms, the deep, uncontrollable shaking of someone who has been holding something enormous for a very long time and has finally completely let it go. You were deceived, I said, by people who were very practiced at it. That's not an excuse. His voice was fierce and broken at the same time. I wanted it too badly. The deal, the validation, I wanted to prove that I could do something bigger than you did, and I let that want make me stupid. He turned and looked up at me, his eyes red and ruined and absolutely honest. I let it make me cruel to you, and I will regret that every day for the rest of my life. I kept my hands on his shoulders. What do you need from me? I asked. Tell me how to fix it, he said. Whatever I have to do, whatever it costs, tell me how to fix it. I thought about Claire's words. We need Ethan to stand up in that room. I thought about the board meeting coming at the end of the week and about James Whitfield sitting in that room with a conflict of interest he had never disclosed, and about Richard Caldwell, who had looked at my son and seen nothing but a tool. There's a board meeting, I said. Friday. Richard is going to try to force the closing through. I squeezed Ethan's shoulders once firmly. I need you in that room. Not on Richard's side. On the side of the truth. Ethan straightened. Something shifted in his face. The grief did not leave, but something else moved in behind it. Something resolute. I'll be there, he said. Whatever you need me to say. Just the truth, I said. That's all. Just exactly what happened, he nodded. Then, Dad. James Whitfield. His voice dropped. I found something in the board notification files, a routing code I did not recognize. It traces back to a private fund account. I did not know what it meant, but I saved the document. He reached into his jacket and set a folded page on the table between us. I think he was working with Richard from the beginning. I wore the suit I had worn the day I signed Harrison Energy's first commercial contract. Eleanor had picked it out navy blue wool with the particular weight of a garment built to last. It was tight across the shoulders now, in a way it had not been in 1990, and the lapels were a style that had gone out and come back twice since then. But I buttoned it anyway, standing in front of the bathroom mirror at 5:30 in the morning. And I looked at the 68-year-old man looking back at me, the lines around his eyes, the white at his temples, the jaw that had held firm through 40 years of negotiations and setbacks, and the particular loneliness of building something in a world that was not yet ready for it. And I said out loud to no one, let's finish this. Claire was waiting outside in her car at 6. She handed me a coffee without speaking, and we rode to the Harrison Energy Building in the particular companionable quiet of two people who have prepared for something so thoroughly that words have become redundant. The building's lobby was already busy when we arrived at 6:45. I had not walked through those doors with a functioning access badge in 2 months. I had not needed to. Today, I did not need a badge. Today, I had something more durable. The security desk was staffed by a young woman I did not recognize. Claire placed our documentation on the counter before the woman could speak. A formal legal notice, 6 pages, filed the previous afternoon with the Harris County District Clerk and served simultaneously on Harrison Energy's registered legal agent. The notice asserted Victor Harrison's right as registered owner of the core intellectual property to attend any board proceeding in which that property was under discussion pursuant to Texas Property Code, Section 134A, and the terms of the original licensing agreement. The young woman read the first page, picked up the phone, and called upstairs. We waited. I drank my coffee. 4 minutes and 30 seconds later, I counted, she put the phone down and said, "You can go up, Mr. Harrison." The elevator to the 40th floor took longer than I remembered, or perhaps I was simply more aware of each second. Claire stood beside me with her briefcase and her legal pad, and the expression she wore when she was ready, not tense, not aggressive, simply present, and absolutely certain of every fact she carried. The boardroom doors were open when we arrived. 8 people were already seated around the long mahogany table. 6 board members, David Walker on the far side, with 2 members of the acquiring consortium's legal team, and Richard Caldwell at the head of the table with a water glass and the composed expression of a man who had decided in advance how this morning was going to go. Ethan was at the opposite end. He was wearing a gray suit I had not seen before, and his face was the face of a man who had made a decision and was living inside it, pale, composed, carrying something heavy with visible effort. When he saw me walk through the door, something moved across his face. Relief, I thought, and grief, and the particular expression of a son who is ashamed and grateful at the same time. Richard saw me half a second after Ethan did. His expression did not crack. The man had too much practice for that, but his right hand moved from the table to his lap, and I noted it the way I noted everything. James Whitfield, seated midway down the table, looked at Richard. A small look, quick, instinctive, the look of a man checking with his handler. I noted that too. "This meeting has a specific agenda," Richard said, his voice filling the room with the practiced authority of a man who has chaired 1,000 rooms. "Outside parties are not—" Claire set her documentation on the table with a sound that was quiet and absolute. "Mr. Harrison is not an outside party." Her voice was clear and calm and carried to every corner of the room without effort. "He is the registered owner of the core intellectual property constituting the primary value of this transaction. Under Texas Property Code Section 134A and the terms of the original licensing agreement between Mr. Harrison and Harrison Energy Systems, he has the legal right to be present at any proceeding in which that property is under discussion." She looked at Richard without blinking. "If you'd like to challenge that right, you're welcome to do so in Harris County District Court. I have a motion ready to file." The room absorbed this. One of the board members, Gerald Patterson, whom I had known for 15 years, looked from Claire to Richard and back again with the careful expression of a man recalibrating. David Walker across the table had opened his portfolio and was writing something in quick, precise strokes. He did not look up. But the fact that he was writing rather than objecting told me that the acquiring consortium had already been briefed by Claire's formal notice of the previous afternoon and had made their own assessment of the situation. Richard looked at me across the length of the mahogany table. His expression was controlled and assessing and utterly without warmth, the look of a man running calculations in real time. Then he smiled, and it was the smile of a man who believes he still has a card to play. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Victor, please, sit down." He gestured toward the chair beside her, with an expansiveness that was designed to look like graciousness, and landed as something else entirely. "The more the merrier." I sat. I placed the worn leather briefcase, Daniel's briefcase, on the table in front of me. I looked around the room, slowly making eye contact with each board member in turn: Gerald Patterson, Susan Fairbanks, Robert Mills, the others, the people I had worked with, argued with, trusted with the governance of something I had built from nothing. Then I looked at James Whitfield. He looked away first. His hand reached for his water glass and missed it slightly. Catching the rim, and the small sound of glass on mahogany was the loudest thing in the room for just a moment. Richard cleared his throat and opened the meeting with the agenda. His voice was smooth. His language was precise. And underneath both, if you had spent 40 years learning to hear what people were not saying, there was the faint, high-frequency tension of a man who knows the ground is softer than it looks and is walking very carefully. He spoke for 4 minutes about the importance of the transaction, the timeline, the benefits to shareholders. Then he paused, looked around the table and said, "I'd like to move directly to the closing authorization vote." Gerald Patterson frowned. "Richard, there are outstanding questions about the technology access situation, which are being resolved," Richard said firmly. "The timeline requires—" "The timeline," Claire said, opening her briefcase, "is the least of this board's concerns this morning." She began placing documents on the table one after another, moving with the calm efficiency of a woman who has been waiting weeks for this exact moment. "What this board needs to discuss first is why one of its members failed to disclose a material conflict of interest before voting to approve this transaction." Every head in the room turned toward James Whitfield. His face went the color of old ash. Richard Caldwell did not flinch when Claire said Whitfield's name. That told me everything about how long he had been preparing for this moment. A man who is genuinely surprised shows it in the body before the face has time to compose itself, a micro-tension, a shift in weight, some involuntary signal. Richard showed none of that. He simply turned toward Claire with the measured attention of a man who has decided in advance that whatever she says next, he has already accounted for it. "James Whitfield," Richard said, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone redirecting a conversation that has gone somewhere inconvenient, "is a distinguished member of this board who has served Harrison Energy with integrity for 6 years. Whatever insinuation—" "It is not an insinuation," Claire said, and she placed the document directly in front of Gerald Patterson, the longest-serving independent board member, the one whose opinion the others followed. "It is a disclosed financial record. Mr. Whitfield holds a private investment position in Caldwell Capital's Horizon Feeder Fund, established 14 months ago, structured under his wife's maiden name, Margaret Oakes Whitfield." She looked at Whitfield directly. "The fund has a projected return tied explicitly to the performance of this acquisition. Mr. Whitfield stood to gain personally from this transaction closing. He did not disclose that position. He voted to approve the preliminary agreement." The room went so still, I could hear the ventilation system above the ceiling tiles. Gerald Patterson was reading the document with the focused intensity of a man who has just understood that the floor beneath him is not what he believed it was. Susan Fairbanks beside him leaned over to read the same page, and the color drained from her face by degrees as her eyes moved down the column. Whitfield pushed back from the table. "That is a private family investment and has no bearing—" "It has every bearing," David Walker said from across the table, and the room turned toward him as one. His voice was quiet and precise, the voice I had first heard at the Four Seasons ballroom, and it carried now the same quality it had carried then, the absolute unhurried authority of a man who knows exactly where he stands. Under the board's own conflict of interest policy, Section 4, any member with a direct or indirect financial interest in a counterparty to a proposed transaction is required to disclose and recuse. Mr. Whitfield did neither. He closed his portfolio with a deliberate sound. His vote on the preliminary approval is void, which means this board never validly authorized this transaction. Richard's jaw tightened barely fractionally, but I had been watching his face for 2 months, and I caught it. He turned toward his own legal team, and the look that passed between them was the look of people rapidly recalculating. This is a procedural matter that can be remedied, Richard said, his voice still smooth, still controlled, but carrying now the faintest edge of a man who is holding something together by force of will. The board can ratify. Before any ratification discussion, Claire said, this board needs to consider what it is being asked to ratify. She continued placing documents, the email chains, the payment records, the recording transcript. Each page landed on the mahogany with the soft, final sound of evidence accumulating. Caldwell Capital represented to the acquiring consortium that Harrison Energy's core technology was fully owned and transferable by the company. That representation was made in writing in the offering memorandum and verbally at the Javits Center Roadshow. She looked at David Walker. Both of those representations were false. The technology belongs to Victor Harrison personally, under a licensing agreement that became void the moment the preliminary acquisition agreement was signed, without his consent. David Walker opened his portfolio again and made a note. "We are aware," he said, and those two words carried the weight of a consortium of investors who had spent a great deal of money on due diligence, and were now sitting in a boardroom in Houston, understanding exactly how they had been misled. Richard stood. The smoothness was still there, but underneath it, for the first time, something was straining. "Victor." He turned to me directly, and his voice dropped into something that was almost personal. "You built something extraordinary. No one disputes that. But this company, these employees, these shareholders, they deserve certainty. They deserve a path forward." He spread his hands. "Name your terms. Whatever it takes to close this transaction, name them." The room held its breath. Gerald Patterson looked at me. Susan Fairbanks looked at me. Even David Walker's pen stopped moving. I stood. My knees were steady, which I was grateful for, because what I felt moving through my body was not triumph. It was something older and heavier and more serious than triumph. I looked around the table at the faces of people who had trusted this company, who had given years to it, who deserved to know the truth of what had been done in their names. I built this company in a garage with 2 people and a notebook. I said, and my voice came out steady and clear. 40 years, every patent, every algorithm, every system in this building. I did not do that to watch it be sold out from under the people who built it with me, by men who saw it as an instrument and nothing more. I looked at Richard. "You want my terms?" "My terms are that this transaction ends, today, in this room." Richard's expression shifted, and what moved across his face in that half-second was something I had not seen there before. Not anger, something closer to the look of a man who has just watched a calculation he was certain of produce the wrong answer. He turned, and he looked at Ethan. "Ethan." His voice was sharp now, the smoothness gone, entirely replaced by something with edges. "You signed the preliminary agreement. You authorized the Nevada tests. You told investors the technology was transferable. He paused, and the pause was a blade. That is on record. Unless you stand up right now and tell this board something very different, that liability is yours. Every person in the room turned toward my son. Every person in that room was looking at my son. I was looking at him too, but differently than the others. They were looking at a CEO, at a defendant, at the man whose signature was on every document that had brought them to this table. I was looking at a 38-year-old man sitting alone at the end of a mahogany table with the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on every line of his face. And I was thinking about a boy who used to knock on my study door with that same careful, uncertain knock and ask if I wanted to come outside. Ethan's hands were flat on the table. I could see them from where I sat, the tendons standing out, the knuckles white, the particular stillness of a person holding themselves together through pure physical effort. His jaw was set. His eyes were dry, which I knew cost him everything, because Ethan Harrison had been crying alone in offices and hallways for weeks. And now, in the one moment when tears might have served him, he refused to use them. 30 seconds passed. I counted every one of them. Then Ethan Harrison pushed back his chair, stood up, and straightened his jacket with a single, precise movement, and I recognized the gesture. It was mine. He had inherited it without knowing the way children inherit the things their parents never meant to teach them. He looked at the board. Not at Richard. Not at me. At the board. I authorized the preliminary acquisition agreement, he said. His voice was clear, and it did not shake, and the effort required to keep it that way was visible in every muscle of his face. I did so based on representations made to me by Caldwell Capital, that the technology transfer was legally complete and unencumbered. Those representations were false. He paused. I was deceived. And because I was deceived, I deceived you. I provided information to this board and to the investor consortium about the status of our core technology that was not accurate. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed his CEO keycard on the table. The small plastic rectangle made almost no sound when it landed, but every person in the room heard it. I am resigning as Chief Executive Officer of Harrison Energy Systems, effective immediately. Richard Caldwell moved so fast his chair scraped back loudly. Ethan! Don't. Ethan turned and looked at his father-in-law, and what was in his face was not the deference of a man who has spent years managing the approval of a powerful family. It was the cold, clear-eyed fury of someone who has finally seen the full picture and is done pretending otherwise. Don't say my name like you're protecting me. I read the 60-day plan, Richard. I heard the recording. His voice cracked once, just once, on the next words, and he did not try to smooth it over. A useful face. That is what you called me. To your lawyers. About my own company. The room erupted. Gerald Patterson was on his feet. Two of the other board members were speaking simultaneously. Richard's legal team was closing laptops and gathering documents with the rapid, practiced efficiency of people who have been in rooms when deals died before and know exactly what the next 24 hours will require of them. David Walker stood. The room did not quiet for him the way it had quieted for Richard at the beginning of this meeting, but his presence carried its own gravity, and within a few seconds the noise had settled enough for him to speak. On behalf of the acquiring consortium, he said, his voice measured and absolute, I am formally notifying this board that we are withdrawing from this transaction. The closing conditions have not been met. The technology ownership representations in the offering memorandum were materially false. The board authorization for the preliminary agreement is void due to undisclosed conflict of interest. He looked at Claire, then at me. Our legal team will be in contact with Ms. Morgan regarding the formal unwinding process and the return of the good faith deposit. He closed his portfolio for the last time. This transaction is over. Richard Caldwell stood very still. The color had not left his face. I will give him that the man had extraordinary control. But something behind his eyes had shifted the way a light source shifts when the power feeding it begins to fail. He looked at David Walker. He looked at Gerald Patterson, who was reading Claire's documents with the expression of a man building a case. He looked at his own legal team, and the silent communication that passed between them lasted perhaps 2 seconds before his lead attorney gave the smallest, most definitive shake of his head. Richard picked up his water glass, set it down, straightened his jacket, the same gesture Ethan had used, I noticed, which told me something about the years my son had spent learning to move like the man who had destroyed him. Then he walked to the door, and he did not look at me as he passed, and he did not say anything, and the sound of his footsteps in the hallway was the most satisfying sound I had heard in 40 years of building things. The room began to empty. Board members clustered in urgent conversation. David Walker's team was already on phones. Claire was writing with focused speed, capturing every word spoken in the last hour while it was still fresh. Ethan was still standing at his end of the table. He was looking at the keycard lying on the mahogany in front of him, that small rectangle of plastic that had given him access to every floor of this building for 8 years. His throat was working. His eyes were bright and wet, and he was blinking hard, refusing to let it break, refusing even now in the wreckage of everything to fall apart in front of a room full of people. I walked the length of the table. I stopped beside my son. I picked up the key card from the table. He watched me do it. His breath uneven, his jaw clenched against whatever was trying to come out, and I held it for a moment. "You did the right thing," I said. Ethan's composure broke then finally completely, with a sound that was barely audible but filled the space between us entirely. He pressed his fist hard against his mouth, shoulders, heaving, eyes squeezing shut. I put my hand on the back of his neck, the way I had when he was small and frightened, and I held it there until the shaking began to slow. "It cost everything." He managed his voice, wrecked and raw. "I know," I said. "That's how you know it was real. People always imagine that justice arrives like lightning, sudden, dramatic, final. It does not. It arrives the way erosion does, one layer at a time over weeks and months, wearing away everything that was built on the wrong foundation, until nothing remains but the bare truth of what was always underneath. I watched it happen from a distance because that was the only place I could be useful. In June, the SEC opened a formal investigation into Caldwell Capital. Claire filed the referral on a Tuesday morning, and by Thursday the Financial Times had the story. Richard's 2 European fund partners withdrew within 72 hours, not dramatically. Not with statements, just quietly and completely, the way serious money moves when it smells liability. Richard hired a Washington law firm with 400 attorneys and issued a statement through them describing the investigation as without merit. The Phoenix case resurfaced in the SEC filing. The third founder, it turned out, had not disappeared. He had been quietly paid to. That arrangement was now part of the federal record. I read the statement over coffee and set the newspaper down without finishing it. In June also, Vanessa filed for divorce, 3 weeks after the boardroom. Before any court had issued a single ruling, before any verdict had been rendered, she froze the joint assets and issued a statement through her own attorney describing the marriage as a partnership that had run its course. No mention of Ethan by name. No acknowledgement of what he had lost, what he had given up, what he had chosen in that room when Richard put a blade to his throat, and he chose the truth anyway. She was simply gone the way a business arrangement ends when the numbers no longer work. Marcus told me Ethan did not cry when he heard. He sat in the apartment he was already in the process of selling, held his phone in both hands, and read the filing 3 times. Then he called Marcus and said in a voice that was wrung completely dry of everything except exhaustion, "I think I always knew. I just didn't want to know that I knew." That sentence broke something in me that I had not realized was still intact. By July, Ethan was facing 3 civil suits from shareholders who had committed capital based on the Javits Center roadshow representations. Claire negotiated the cooperation agreement that reduced his criminal exposure significantly because Ethan had come forward voluntarily, had provided testimony, had not destroyed documents. The civil liability was real and substantial. He sold the penthouse. He sold the car. He moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Midtown Houston and began the particular grinding work of rebuilding a financial life from a position of genuine humility. Daniel Ford moved to Montana in July. His daughter lived there, and he had grandchildren he had not spent enough time with. And I think he needed to be somewhere that did not remind him of every choice he had made in the past year. He sent me a letter before he left, handwritten 4 pages, in the careful engineer's script I had known for 40 years. I read it once. I folded it and put it in the left drawer of my desk, the same drawer where I kept the original sketches from 1985. Some things you do not display. Some things you simply keep. Marcus Webb became Harrison Energy's chief operating officer in August, under the restructured governance model Claire and I built with the new board. His name went on his office door and on every report he produced, and on the organizational chart that went to every employee in the company. He called me the evening after his first day in the role, and his voice was the voice of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not dare to expect. And he said, "Victor, I don't know how to thank you." And I said, "Build something real. That's all the thanks I need." He laughed a genuine, unguarded laugh, and I realized I had not heard that sound in a very long time. September came with the first cool air of a Houston autumn, which is not dramatic but is real, and one afternoon Ethan appeared at my door without calling ahead. He was thinner. He had let his hair grow a little longer, and there were new lines around his eyes that had not been there in March, and he was wearing a plain gray t-shirt and jeans that made him look less like a CEO and more like the boy who used to help me carry equipment into the garage on Saturday mornings. We sat on the back porch. I made coffee. The garden was still going. Eleanor's roses had come back for the 31st year in a row, red and stubborn and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened since she planted them. "You knew this was going to happen," Ethan said. His voice was quiet and without accusation. "From the very beginning, you had everything in place." "I knew what I owned," I said. "I didn't know what you would choose." His throat worked. He looked at the roses. "I destroyed everything I touched." "You destroyed what was already built wrong," I said. "That's a different thing." "I blamed you." His voice dropped to something rough and low. "In my head for months I told myself you had set a trap, that you let it happen on purpose to humiliate me." He pressed his fist against his knee, and I could see the tension in it, the force of a man holding himself accountable in real time. That was easier than admitting I walked in with my eyes open and chose not to see. "Ethan, let me finish." His jaw tightened. "I trusted Richard more than I trusted you. I trusted Vanessa more than I trusted you. I trusted my own ambition more than I trusted 40 years of watching you build something real." His eyes went bright and wet, and his voice broke in half on the next sentence. "And I stood at a microphone and thanked you for your service, Dad. Like you were nobody. Like everything you gave was just background." He pressed both hands over his face, shoulders shaking. "I am so sorry. I am so profoundly, completely sorry." My chest ached with a grief and a love so thoroughly intertwined I could not have separated them. I reached over and put my hand on my son's arm, that shaking, bowed arm of a 38-year-old man who had learned the hardest lessons in the hardest possible way. "I know," I said. "I know you are." He lowered his hands. His face was wet and raw and more honest than I had seen it in years, maybe in decades. "Is there anything left?" he asked. "For me. Is there anything left to build?" I looked at Eleanor's roses red against the September afternoon. I thought about garages and notebooks and problems that had not yet been solved. "There is always something left," I said. "The question is what you're willing to rebuild with." He nodded slowly. Then after a moment, "What are you doing next?" "Going back to where it started," I told Ethan. "There is something I left unfinished." He looked at me for a long, quiet moment, that unmistakable look of a son trying to read his father, the same searching expression he had given me when he was 12 years old, and I told him that a drafty garage full of half-assembled equipment was going to change the entire world. Back then, he had believed me with the uncomplicated, pristine faith that belongs only to childhood. Now he believed me with something far harder won and infinitely more durable, the quiet, resilient belief of a man who has known failure, who has been broken by circumstance, and who is learning slowly and deliberately what he is actually made of inside his own heart. "Can I come see it?" he asked gently. "When it is ready." "When it is ready," I said, "you will be the very first call I make." The garage was situated on the west side of Houston, located in an expansive neighborhood that had been purely industrial back in 1985 and was now a complicated, eclectic mixture of storage warehouses, small family restaurants, and the particular creative disorder of a sprawling city perpetually in the process of reinventing itself. I had bought the property back in 2010, not because I had an immediate commercial plan for it, but because I simply could not bear to watch a demolition crew tear down the brick walls that had sheltered our earliest dreams. The original painted metal sign above the door was long gone, yet the weathered concrete floor still had the dark, stubborn stain from our first prototype coolant leak in the sweltering summer of 1987. I had always loved that stain. It was tangible, permanent proof that something real had happened here. I unlocked the heavy door in October and walked in for the first time in 11 years. The interior air smelled like settled dust, aged iron motor lubricant, and something subtle underneath all of those. Something that I could only describe as pure possibility, though I am well aware that is not a recognized scientific measurement. I stood motionless in the doorway for a quiet moment, feeling the particular emotional weight of returning to a physical place that had fundamentally shaped who you are. And then I walked over to the sturdy workbench, pulled the protective canvas cover off the old desk lamp, and turned it on. The light was exactly the same as memory. It was warm, slightly yellow, throwing the same long shadows across the timber bench that it had thrown when I was 30 years younger, and Eleanor used to bring fresh coffee out at midnight. She would always set the steaming mug on the corner of the bench without saying anything, because she understood that some work requires the specific gentle silence of a person who trusts you completely. I sat down on the wooden stool, opened a brand new notebook, clean white pages, the same durable blue cover I had always used, and wrote one clear sentence across the first page. The answer is yes. Dreams come true, but only if you are honest about what you do not know yet. Then I turned to page 2 and began. The third-generation battery technology had been waiting for me for 7 long years, a fundamental physics problem I had mapped the outer edges of and then set aside because running a $90 billion corporation had required every single piece of me, and this particular engineering problem required far more uninterrupted creative focus than I had available in boardrooms. The goal was simple to describe and extraordinarily difficult to achieve a high-density battery, small enough to fit inside a standard canvas backpack, efficient enough to power an entire household for 3 consecutive days, and cheap enough that a working family in rural Mississippi or an off-grid village in Kenya could easily afford one. It was not a product designed for Wall Street investors. It was not a product conceived for an initial public offering roadshow. It was an essential machine engineered for real people. I worked diligently every afternoon that October through all of November and straight into the cool days of December. Marcus came by on a bright Saturday morning in November with 2 cups of coffee and stood at the workbench beside me for 2 hours, examining the early circuit layouts and asking sharp technical questions with the genuine, unvarnished curiosity of a gifted engineer who is still learning. And I remembered why I had believed in him from the very beginning. Claire stopped in one Thursday evening on her way home from Chase Tower, still dressed in her formal courtroom clothes, and looked at the mechanical sketches spread across the bench and said, "This is going to be significant, is it not?" And I said, "I do not know yet. That is what makes it interesting." She laughed a real laugh, the kind of unguarded melodic sound she almost never produced in corporate legal settings, and I realized I had not heard her laugh like that in a very long time, and that it was one of the better sounds I knew. In November, I signed the formal restructuring papers for Harrison Energy Systems. The new governance model gave every senior research engineer a permanent, legally protected equity stake in the intellectual property they personally created. No executive board could ever sell or license what an individual inventor had built without their explicit consent. Every creator's name stayed attached to their work permanently, regardless of who held the company's common stock or who sat in the chief executive chair. Marcus announced the new structure at a company-wide assembly, and Claire sent me the video clip immediately afterward. I watched it once, 2,000 working people listening to a young leader explain that the fruits of their labor belonged entirely to them, and I had to set my phone down because my vision had gone blurry in a way that I was not going to examine too closely. December came. The Houston winter settled in its mild, half-committed way, cool enough for a jacket, not cold enough for genuine complaint. One quiet evening, as I was working through a difficult set of thermal equations at the bench, my phone buzzed on the corner where I had set it. A text from Ethan Dad. "I have a job interview tomorrow morning. It is with a small clean energy startup in Austin. They want to know if I am willing to learn everything from the very beginning." I told them yes without hesitation. What do you think? I looked at the glowing message for a moment. I looked at the workbench in front of me, the new sketches, the calculations, the small, elegant problem that was slowly, beautifully beginning to yield to patience. I looked down at the dark coolant stain on the concrete floor, 38 years old, and still there, lasting proof that something real had happened in this room once, and could happen again. I typed back 3 words: "Yes, you can." I put the phone in my pocket and picked up my pencil. Outside, Houston was doing what Houston always does in December, moving forward, building and reinventing itself without asking permission from anyone. The lamp threw its warm yellow light across the page. The garage smelled like dust-cold metal and the specific, irreplaceable scent of a stubborn problem that is beginning to give way. I was 68 years old. I had built one vast empire, watched others nearly steal it away, and chosen not to let that struggle be the last thing I made. I had a fresh notebook, a sturdy wooden bench, and an essential question that no one had answered yet. That was enough. That had always been enough. People ask me sometimes what I learned from all of it. I tell them this: the most dangerous thing a man can do is build something real and then forget why he built it in the first place. I am not a perfect father. I was not a perfect founder. There were years I chose the laboratory over the living room. Years I assumed that providing was the same as being present. If I could say one thing to the younger version of myself, it would be this. Do not wait until someone tries to take everything before you remember what actually matters. I believe with everything I have left that God does not waste suffering. Every loss in this story, Ethan's, Daniel's, even my own, carried inside it the exact lesson each of us needed and had been avoiding. That is not coincidence. That is grace working in the way grace usually does, quietly through the hardest possible door. My personal belief is simple: what you build with integrity cannot truly be taken from you. They can take the name, they can take the building, but the mind that created it, that goes wherever you go. If this family story reached something in you, if you have ever watched someone you love mistake ambition for wisdom, or if you yourself have been the person in the boardroom who chose wrong and had to find a way back, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me your story. Share this grandpa stories with someone who needs it today, because the right words at the right moment can change the entire direction of a life. And if you believe in what we're building here together, subscribe so the next Grandpa Stories finds you before someone else needs it more. Every family story deserves to be told honestly. Every Grandpa Stories carries a truth the next generation needs. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the very end of this family story. And one final word: the stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and life lessons. If that is not the content for you, no hard feelings. Choose what feeds your soul. But if you're staying, I'll see you in the next one.